September the 11th, 2001. The world watched in horror as two hijacked planes crashed into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The events of that day were broadcast live and uncut around the world. Millions of people in their homes and offices watched as ordinary men and women jumped to their deaths from the burning skyscrapers, as thick black smoke obscured the iconic Manhattan skyline. Then finally, one by one, the towers collapsed, sending raging dust clouds through the streets upon which so many classic American films had been set. 4 years later, on the 7th of July 2005, terrorists once again unleashed panic and devastation, this time in London. 3 bombs exploded in quick succession on underground trains, and a 4th was detonated on the upper deck of a bus almost an hour later. A decade of media scaremongering followed these terrorist attacks, cultivating a climate of fear, with politicians on both sides of the Atlantic declaring war on that vaguest of enemies, terror. A war on terror which led to hostility towards ethnic minorities on home soil, and a gung-ho military invasion of Iraq.
Cinema has always been an effective tool for confronting audiences with societal anxieties.
Stop it, please, I beg you!
This film will examine how cinema has addressed the war on terror, specifically cultural differences between American and British responses to the climate of fear.
Conclusions will be drawn by examining 4 films: Cloverfield and United 93, 2 American films which address 9/11, and 4 Lions and London River, British films which concern the events of 7/7. Although united by a theme of terrorism, these films approach the topic in wildly different ways. Cloverfield is an alien invasion film which utilises 9/11 imagery, whilst United 93 is a fact-based film set on board the 4th hijacked plane. Similarly, the films addressing 7/7 also have contrasting approaches. 4 Lions is a black comedy following a group of inept fundamentalists as they plot a terrorist attack, whereas London River is a drama which follows 2 strangers united by their search for their missing children in the aftermath of 7/7. In order to examine these films, it is important to understand where they sit within the wider context of films addressing terror. There have been a great number of films which concern the effects of war in Iraq and subsequently Afghanistan, the first of which began to appear in cinemas in 2006, 3 years after the initial invasion in 2003. These include documentaries such as Iraq in Fragments and fictional films such as The Hurt Locker. However, although these films received some critical success, they generally fail to attract large cinema audiences. Theorist Susan Carruthers argues that films concerning war do not generally attract large audiences during times of conflict because cinema is regarded as a form of escapism. With the media saturated with images of warfare, audiences do not wish to be confronted with the very subject they were hoping to be distracted from. Arguably, this saturation of the media causes those who are watching television in their living rooms to also become victims of the traumas of war. Audiences are so used to being bombarded by graphic footage of conflict that we become unflinching and completely desensitised to the footage, spectators of a war abroad which, in the words of Carruthers, fails to punctuate the surface of everyday life. Why then have these 4 films bucked the trend and achieved relative critical and box office success? Because unlike the documentaries and dramas set amidst a dusty and barren landscape, these films address events which had an impact on the everyday lives of Western audiences. The perpetrators of 9/11 were ostensibly highly media savvy and succeeded in creating some of the most iconic and truly spectacular events ever captured on camera. Guy Debord stated that the spectacle is not a collection of images, rather it is a social relationship between people that is mediated by images. This statement can be applied to 9/11 because the events of that day triggered such dramatic changes that we now recognise ourselves to be living in a post-9/11 society. Politicians and the media alike capitalised on the iconic impact of the footage, its spectacular quality, along with the fear and fragility of society in the aftermath of the attacks, to create a climate of fear. Photographs and footage of 9/11 were replayed at almost every opportunity to cement the idea that the Western world was under fire. This fear led to a breakdown of trust within society, with hatred and suspicion being directed towards minority groups, largely based on ethnicity.
Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim.
So began the War on Terror, and a decade dominated by the fear of an invisible threat. Fairy tales and folklore have long taught us to fear the unseen, but every fairy tale needs a real baddie, and who better to become the logo for this relentless campaign against terror than the man claiming responsibility for the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden. He even helpfully had already appeared on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted fugitives and terrorists for his involvement in the 98 US Embassy bombings. Politicians and the media alike presented the idea that bin Laden headed a global terror network called Al-Qaeda, whilst also suggesting terrorists were operating within our own communities. The fear of these invisible threats was emphasised by the fact that the military were unable to find bin Laden until May 2011, or any of the other supposed terror threats, such as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The impression created by the media was that the inability to find threats did not disprove their existence, but instead suggested that those intent on terror had outsmarted the authorities.
But how many Al-Qaeda have you captured?
We haven't captured any Al-Qaeda, but...
And how many have you actually managed to kill here in southeast Afghanistan?
We haven't killed any.
The nature of the attacks on 9/11 and 7/7, and the way that they were reported, has had a very pronounced impact on the cinema of terror. During 9/11, the majority of the action occurred in the skyscrapers, towering above the city, a perfect stage set into the sky. With so many witnesses, particularly of the second plane's impact, it did not take long to establish exactly what had happened. Professional news crews were on the scene within minutes, and many civilians also grabbed their camcorders and began recording history in the making. However, this was not the case during 7/7, with the initial explosions occurring underground. 9/11 conveyed dramatic rolling news of fire, smoke and collapsing towers, whereas the first news reports during 7/7 were vague, suggesting there had been a power surge on the underground, with little in the way of dramatic footage. However, the explosion on the bus at Tavistock Gardens changed the situation, indicating a terrorist attack and bringing the horror to the surface. It was around this time that emergency services were able to reach casualties from the underground bombs, transforming tube station foyers into war zone hospitals in order to treat the injured on scene. These terrorist attacks and the resulting climate of fear have been addressed by cinema through the use of visual aesthetics. No matter how many times the footage of the plane crashing or the collapse of the towers has been replayed, somehow it is still hard to comprehend that 9/11 actually happened, and that the footage hasn't been taken from the latest Hollywood blockbuster. With little existing framework with which to comprehend the attacks, one of the most common exclamations of disbelief was, "It felt like a movie." The nature of the events was so horrific that cinema struggles to approach the topic directly, and instead displaces the fear and spectacle into other forms. A key example of this is Cloverfield, which uses 9/11 imagery and terrorism metaphors. One of Cloverfield's most characteristic features is its use of handheld cameras. This distinctive aesthetic draws on the now iconic footage of 9/11, which was largely shot by amateurs on non-professional equipment. This shaky and often out-of-focus footage very effectively conveys the panic of the situation. This amateur aesthetic is used to such an extent that there are some shots which almost exactly replicate footage captured during the events of 9/11.
Did you guys see that? Did you guys see that? Oh, all right.
Although Cloverfield's use of handheld cameras is used primarily to replicate amateur footage of September the 11th, it can also be linked to the significance of mobile phone footage during 7/7, as this was the first occasion when images from mobile phones were incorporated into news broadcasts. In a similar manner to witnesses of 9/11 recording the action with camcorders, those trapped underground documented the event with the technology in their pockets. As it was impossible for camera crews to access the chaos underground, these were the only images available for the media to use. The resulting images were gloomy, with green undertones, and were highly evocative and almost reminiscent of Henry Moore's paintings of the underground station being used as air raid shelters during World War II. This link to World War II was also reflected in the aftermath of 7/7, with the media hailing reborn Blitz spirit as commuters continued to use public transport. Another way that 7/7 has influenced the visual aesthetics of cinema is through the use of surveillance and CCTV footage. CCTV played a key role in identifying the 7/7 bombers and also piecing together the events of that day. Paul Greengrass, director of United 93, addresses the importance of surveillance in The Bourne Ultimatum, with a scene which highlights the extent to which large public spaces are monitored. A chase sequence filmed at London Waterloo Station incorporates use of the station's CCTV cameras, demonstrating how almost every inch of the station is covered by the surveillance system, effectively allowing security teams to track the movements of an individual through a crowd.
Move through this crowd. Get under cover right now. Move through this crowd.
This ability to identify and track a suspect is also present in Four Lions, during the final scenes which are set during a marathon. However, reflecting the film's comedic genre, this scene involves a rather unfortunate misunderstanding.
Bear is down. Repeat, the bear is down. They've got the bear.
I think that's a Wookiee. That's a Wookiee.
No, it's not. It's a bear.
Is a Wookiee a bear control?
The bear target is changed. It's now target Honey Monster.
Is a honey monster a bear?
A honey monster is not a bear.
A honey monster is a bear. The honey monster is down. He was a target. He was a bear.
A honey monster is down.
Honey monster is not down control. We have a Wookiee down.
Also Wookiee.
Technology plays a key role in the war on terror and is successfully reflected in Four Lions. The central characters are in constant communication with each other via mobile phone and use the technology to record their activities.
Not so far!
However, they are also aware that their intentions could potentially be intercepted through the SIM cards, so they make a point of destroying them.
Look, the way to stop the feds tracking you is very simple. You eat your SIM card. Get your SIM cards out. You remove the SIM card, and yes?
Can I cook mine?
No, you must eat it raw, like this. Good boys.
The characters are also aware of surveillance, but this is again presented comically.
What are you doing?
It's in case they're taking pictures.
What?
But it says you come out blurry.
The aesthetic of terror is also very effectively utilised during the opening scene, when the group attempt to make an Al-Qaeda styled video.
Action.
Hey, you unbelieving kafar bastards. I'm gonna turn your baby.
No.
What?
What's with the gun?
Proper replica, man.
What for? Action, man?
The terrorist hijackers in United 93 are unnamed and do not display any affection towards each other. They are presented as cold, in control, and absolutely set on causing death and destruction. In this way, they represent the anonymous face of terror. They are not people, they are terrorists. This, however, does not apply to the representation of terrorists in Four Lions. Here the characters are named and are seen to affectionately interact with each other and their families.
Bedtime for you.
Drawing on the identities of the 7/7 bombers who were British and primarily from the north of England, the film is predominantly set in Sheffield, and all of the terrorists have strong northern accents and use regional dialects. Omar occasionally speaks in Arabic, but this is used for comic effect.
Right, Barry, listen, if you can answer this question, you can come.
All right.
Okay, बंदर के टट्टे तेरी उर्दू कैसी है? गधे की गांड?
Arguably, the film also addresses sensationalist news stories regarding British non-Muslims converting to Islamic extremism. This idea is explored through Barry's character, whose behaviour and ideas are bigger and badder than his peers, presumably to compensate for his own ethnicity.
Listen, I am the most Al-Qaeda one here.
Think of the group, Barry. Think of what we're trying to do, right? It's best to stay here, bro. You're a liability and you're a loose cannon.
What? Bollocks, I'm a liability. I am the invisible jihadi. They seek him here, they seek him there, but he's not there. He's blowing up your slag sister.
Comedy is used throughout the film to humanise the terrorists by presenting them as idiotic. Their schemes are badly planned and often ridiculous, whilst the jokes and in-group banter provide temporary distractions from their destructive intentions.
Dancing in the moonlight, everybody's feeling warm and bright. It's such a fine exercise.
In many ways, the idiocy of the terrorists reflects the several failed and foiled plots since 7/7, such as the infamous trouser bomber in 2009.
The only thing that prevented the defendant from being successful that day was his own bad luck.
Unlike the hijackers in United 93, the terrorists in Four Lions have doubts about the morality of their intentions.
Blowing up Kafar and that, is that totally legit, yeah?
Yeah.
Good. Now, wicked. I will just checking in that.
The characters are so likeable that when watching the film, one is almost willing their ludicrous plans to succeed, until we realise what this would mean. In terms of genre, Four Lions is arguably a very British response to terror. A review in the Daily Telegraph hails director Chris Morris's method of contracting media hysteria by suggesting not all terrorists are ideologically honed, precision-bladed revolutionaries and are just as likely to be a raggle-taggle dad's army of chancers, mouthy dossers and chumpheads. Morris has succeeded in removing the fear from the invisible threat by presenting a group of ridiculous, although wholly likeable characters. If most terrorists are like Ammar, Hassan, Waj, Faisal and Barry, we really have no reason to be afraid. This emphasis on character is particularly evident in British films concerning the war on terror. In the same way that Four Lions uses character to portray an unseen side of terrorism, characterisation is used in London River to reveal the emotional pain and anguish caused by terrorist attacks. Unlike the dramatic events themselves, this issue is not widely covered by the media. London River centres around the fragile friendship of two strangers, Elizabeth and Usman, who arrive in London shortly after 7/7 in search of their missing children. Interestingly, out of the 4 films in this selection, London River is also the only film which shows grief from a Muslim perspective.
Ali, ande atura balau kono. Balau ba min kera atura la. Adumbi bolfe min kono. Atira ka yere here. Ai. Sudon tiseka kala. Foi mato. Moasima boala.
Although Four Lions does have tragic elements, other than the fleeting words of goodbye between Ammar and his wife Sophia, we do not see how the families of the inept terrorists cope with the aftermath of their actions. Director Rashid Bushareb says, "I wanted to show that Muslims, as much as anyone else, are victims of terrorist attacks. That's often forgotten." This one-sidedness can perhaps be linked to attitudes in the media at the time, which largely presented non-Muslims as the only victims in the war on terror. As aforementioned, the years which followed 9/11 and 7/7 were times of social tension, with a rise in right-wing attitudes and suspicion and hatred frequently directed towards ethnic minorities. London River captures this hostility through Elizabeth's character and her initial attitudes towards Usman.
Pardon?
Je suis Ousmane.
Oh.
Bonjour.
Hello. Yes. Okay.
S'il vous plaît. C'est votre fille?
Oui, c'est ma fille. Où cette photo a été prise?
À la mosquée.
Puis-je la voir encore?
Bien sûr.
Merci.
Je voulais seulement vous aider.
Hello? Police, please. Yes, thank you.
Elizabeth's suspicion continues when she discovers her daughter Jane and Usman's son Ali had been taking Arabic lessons together, a notion that confuses and frightens her.
I don't know what's going on. She's been learning Arabic. I've got a terrible feeling she's been converted. No, I'm not being silly, Edward. I met this African who's got a photograph of her at the mosque. I'm serious. I've been to the police. They've even been here and searched the flat. This place is absolutely crawling with Muslims. It is. Her landlord's a Muslim. I'm really scared, Edward.
Elizabeth does not intend to be malicious. She is simply frightened of something she does not understand, and so lashes out with her misguided views. However, after some initial tension, Elizabeth and Usman become united by their search and ultimately by their grief.
Bon voyage. Et merci.
Merci à toi.
Their ability to help one another can be likened to the reborn Blitz spirit hailed by the press in the aftermath of 7/7, because it ultimately presents them as tolerant and determined. London River focuses on emotional trauma and does not include any dramatic action scenes or graphic imagery. However, it does utilise the emotional impact of specific iconography, the terror of the image, relating to disaster, such as posters providing names and photographs of missing people.
Oh my God.
These emotionally charged images of posters attached to fences and buildings relate not just to 7/7, but also to September the 11th, when those searching for missing people were left waiting and wondering, in some cases for weeks, to discover the fate of their loved ones. Although the posters themselves are not horrific, their presence weeks after an incident implies the gruesome nature of the attacks, which made it very difficult to identify individual victims. This is demonstrated in London River towards the end of the film, when Elizabeth finally learns what has happened to her daughter.
Je suis vraiment désolé, c'est impossible. Notre psychologue va venir.
Unlike British responses to 7/7, which are largely character-based, American responses to 9/11 place far more emphasis on action. United 93 is a fact-based reconstruction of events on board the fourth hijacked plane during 9/11. The film is set in real time, creating a harrowing account of Flight 93's journey from takeoff to crash landing, including the scenes of chaos in the control room. A lot of the characters remain nameless, and the passengers are not seen to form relationships with one another. This represents the fact that passengers on board a plane are usually predominantly strangers, and given the urgency and panic of the hijacking situation, they would not have had time to introduce themselves, an effect which is emphasised through the casting and the decision to use relatively unknown actors. This also presents the passengers as anonymous and innocent victims, implying that at any point, anyone can find themselves in the midst of a terrorist attack. This emphasis on action in American responses to 9/11 is also present in Cloverfield, which very much draws on the spectacle of a disaster. Unlike Cloverfield and Four Lions, which draws on the climate of fear and media hysteria surrounding terrorism, United 93 and London River are based on the actual events of 9/11 and 7/7, respectively. As well as addressing the subject matter directly, these films also use real archive footage from the events.
Normal life in one of the busiest parts of the capital has now been suspended. As just a few yards down the road here, they continue to care for the injured, and all around, groups of Londoners are standing on corners asking themselves what has happened here and who could possibly have done this. A man who might have some of the answers, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, visited the scene of the devastated bus.
The bus is a bomb that has gone off in the back of the upper part of the bus. That's all I'm going to say at the moment. We do need to investigate it.
Could have been a suicide bomb.
There's no reason to suggest that. There's no reason to deny that. It's just there is not enough information at this stage to make that.
Yeah, descending rapidly. No, there he is. There he is, right there, over the Verrazano Bridge. Oh yeah. Look how fast he's going. He's going right up the Hudson River Center. Oh my God. Jesus Christ. Did you see that? Did you see that, sir? I'll have to call you back.
By comparing these four films, we can deduce that ultimately 7/7 has not had as much of an impact on cinema as 9/11. The primary reason for this is due to the nature of the attacks in terms of their visibility to the media and the amount of immediate destruction they caused. There is also an element of scale involved. Although 7/7 claimed the lives of 52 victims, almost 3,000 people died during 9/11, including members of the emergency services who died trying to rescue others. The perpetrators of 9/11 attacked iconic symbols of America and chose to do so in a manner which would guarantee people around the world would be watching. As the towers extended high above lower Manhattan, their position allowed the public and camera crews alike to have a perfect view of the spectacle. The New York skyline was changed forever, and films and television programs incorporating the city's iconic skyline unwittingly became split into two categories, pre- and post 9/11, with audiences unable to separate shots of the buildings before the attacks from the memory and the horror of the events. Whilst it can be argued that the 7/7 bombers attacked iconic symbols of London, as the action largely unfolded underground, the nature of the attacks did not provide the same wealth of imagery for filmmakers to utilise. Certain imagery from the attacks has become deeply ingrained in the collective memories of audiences, allowing filmmakers to incorporate specific terror-related iconography into their work. For example, the dust clouds caused by the collapse of the towers have become a feature in post-9/11 action and sci-fi films such as Spielberg's War of the Worlds. America has a culture of commemoration rarely seen in the UK, and it is in this view that the 2008 documentary Man on Wire can be perceived as an example of post-9/11 cinema. The film makes no mention of the attacks, but instead celebrates the feat of human achievement which once took place high above the ground. The number of films concerning 9/11 vastly outweighs the number addressing 7/7, and Ground Zero is now one of New York's major tourist attractions. By comparison, the victims of 7/7 are honoured with a memorial in Hyde Park and plaques at the affected tube stations. Ever since 9/11, the events of that day have been used as justification for military action and otherwise unjust intervention. In this respect, cinema has become another method of reinforcing the idea that the West experienced a massive injustice on that day. This can be supported by the representation of the hijackers in New 1993, and the fact that the film does not provide any insight about why the hijackers chose to pursue such a course of action. The comparatively small response to 7/7 from British cinema can be linked to cultural attitudes in the UK, which in the spirit of the Blitz tends not to dwell on tragedy. Although 52 people were killed during 7/7, Britain itself did not wish to be viewed as a victim. The public resiliently and proudly continued to use London's buses and underground trains, refusing to admit defeat and change its ways as a response to terror. A final comparison which can be made between British and American cinema's response to terrorism is the emphasis on character or action. American responses to 9/11 are largely action-packed and often rely on imagery from the event, whilst in comparison, responses to 7/7 are more character-based. These variations in genre may be linked to different responses to grief and cultural differences between America and the UK.